9 months after I came home missing most of my right leg, I overheard my own brother in the kitchen asking my mother how long I was going to be like this. Not how I was doing, how long. I was in the next room, in a chair, with my back to the doorway, and I heard the exact tone he used. The tone you use about a broken appliance you haven't gotten around to hauling out yet. And my mother didn't defend me. She sighed, the way she does, and said she didn't know. I was 26 years old. I had a folded flag's worth of paperwork, a prosthetic I couldn't tolerate for more than 40 minutes, and a family that had already, quietly, moved me into the column marked problem. 4 years later, I was the one covering my mother's mortgage. I want to be careful how I say that, because it isn't a revenge story, and it doesn't end the way people expect. But it's true, and getting there broke and rebuilt just about everything I understood about what family actually means. Let me tell you who I was before, because it matters to everything that comes after. I grew up in a house where being useful was the whole currency. My father drove a delivery route for 22 years, and my mother did payroll for a school district, and between them, they raised 3 kids on a budget that worked as long as nothing unexpected happened. Something unexpected always happened. A transmission, a furnace, a hospital visit for my sister's asthma. We absorbed it, every time, by everybody working a little more. My older brother Dale was the one who stayed. He got a job at a lumber yard out of high school, married his girlfriend at 20, had 2 kids by 24, and settled into the exact life the neighborhood expected of him. My younger sister Kayla was the smart one, the one everybody assumed would get out. And I was the one who enlisted at 19, which in my family was treated as roughly halfway between a career choice and a betrayal, depending on who was in the room. I want to be honest about my reasons. It wasn't patriotism, at least not primarily. It was math. My father had been laid off 8 months earlier and had been picking up warehouse shifts at 54 years old, and I was watching a man who had never once in my life complained come home at 2 in the morning and sit in his truck in the driveway for 10 minutes before he could make himself walk inside. I didn't have a plan for college. I had a recruiter's business card and a way to stop being one more mouth in a house that couldn't afford the ones it had. I sent money home from my first deployment. I want to say that plainly, because it becomes important later. From the age of 20, every single month, I sent $400 to $600 back to that house. Not because anybody asked, because I'd figured out that being useful was the currency, and I finally had some. That money paid a car repair. It paid a chunk of Kayla's community college tuition. It covered my parents' mortgage for 2 full months during a stretch when my father was between things and nobody talked about how close it got. I did 8 years. 2 deployments. I was good at the job. Not exceptional, but reliable, which in that world is worth more. I had a plan for what came after. I was going to use the education benefit, get into a logistics program, come home with a skill and a savings account, and finally be the one in the family who'd figured something out. I was 26, and 4 months from the end of my second deployment, when a vehicle I was riding in went over a pressure plate on a road we'd driven 40 times. I don't remember the explosion. I remember about 6 seconds of being confused about why the sky was where the ground had been, and then I remember a man named Corporal Ruiz, whose first name I embarrassingly did not know at the time, holding a tourniquet on my leg and telling me to look at his face and not at anything else. And I remember thinking, with the specific clarity of a person in shock, that my mother was going to be upset about this. That's the last coherent thought I had for about 11 days. I found out later that Ruiz was 19. 19 years old, 6 weeks into his first deployment, and he did the thing correctly, under conditions I have never been able to fully imagine even having been inside them. I wrote him a letter about 2 years afterward that took me 4 months to finish, and he wrote back in about a week, and his entire reply was 4 sentences long, and one of them was a joke, which is exactly what I needed and exactly what I would not have known to ask for. I've come to understand that most of the important things that happened to me in this story were done by people who did not particularly think of themselves as doing anything important at the time. They took the leg above the knee. That distinction sounds technical, and it isn't. A below-knee amputation and an above-knee amputation are two completely different lives, and I learned that over the following 2 years the hard way, one failure at a time. I woke up at a military hospital in Germany with my mother's voice in the room, which the army had flown her out for, and which I have never fully thanked anybody for arranging. She was good in that hospital. I want that on the record, because a lot of what comes next is hard, and I don't want to flatten her into a villain. My mother sat in a chair in that room for 9 days. She learned the names of every nurse. She wrote things down in a spiral notebook when doctors talked, because I couldn't hold on to information yet. The trouble didn't start in the hospital. The trouble started at home about 4 months later, and it started so gradually that I didn't recognize it as trouble until it was structural. I moved back into my parents' house because there was nowhere else. My own savings had gone into a truck I now couldn't drive, and an apartment lease near base I had to break. My medical retirement paperwork was in process, which is a phrase that means you will have almost no reliable income for somewhere between 4 and 14 months, while people in an office you'll never see determine your percentage. That's the part nobody warns you about. Everybody understands the leg. Nobody understands the 11 months of paperwork. So I was 26 years old, back in the bedroom I'd grown up in, with a mother who had converted the downstairs office into a room for me because I couldn't do stairs yet, sleeping under a ceiling fan I'd stared at as a teenager, unable to work, unable to drive, unable to shower without a plastic chair, and being handled by everybody in that house with a kind of careful gentleness that I mistook, at first, for love. Some of it was love, and some of it was the beginning of something else. The first hard thing was the money. Within about 2 months, the household arithmetic that had always worked started not working, and I was the new variable. My prescriptions had co-pays. My physical therapy was 40 minutes away, and somebody had to drive me. The bathroom got a grab bar and a raised toilet seat that cost $200 my father paid for without a word, and that I heard about indirectly for the next year. And here's the part I've had to sit with a long time. For 6 years, I had been the one sending money into that house. I had been an asset. And then, in the space of about a week, I became a line item on the expense side, and nobody in that family, including me, had any idea how to talk about it. I want to add one more thing about that stretch, because it's the detail that explains the rest. In my family, nobody says anything directly, ever. Not about money, not about feelings, not about the fact that a man in his 50s was working warehouse shifts at 2 in the morning. Everything gets communicated sideways, in a tone, in a sigh, in a comment about something adjacent. I'd grown up fluent in that language and had never once questioned it. So when I came home broken, that language had no vocabulary for it. There was no way to say, "We're scared," or "This is more than we can carry," or "I love you and I don't know how to help." All that existed were sighs and tones and comments about something adjacent, and I heard every one of them, correctly, for what they were, for 11 months. The comment in the kitchen came in month 9. How long is he going to be like this? I want to describe what that does to a person, because I think a lot of people watching this have overheard some version of that sentence about themselves, from somebody who was supposed to be on their side. It doesn't make you angry, not right away. That's the part that surprised me. What it does first is confirm something you already suspected, and there's a horrible relief in confirmation. You stop wondering whether you're imagining it. You've been reading the room correctly this whole time. I didn't say anything. I sat in that chair with my back to the doorway, and I listened to my mother sigh and say she didn't know, and then I listened to them change the subject to something about Dale's truck, and I sat there until they were both gone from the kitchen, and then I wheeled myself into the bathroom and sat in there for about 40 minutes, which is where I did most of my thinking that year. Here's what I want to be fair about. Dale wasn't a monster. Dale was 31, with 2 kids, and a wife working part-time, working 60 hours at a lumber yard and driving over 3 or 4 nights a week to help move his brother around a house. He was exhausted. He'd been exhausted before I got hurt. What he said in that kitchen was the sentence of a man at the end of something, not a cruel man. But understanding why somebody said a thing doesn't remove the thing from where it landed. After that, I started noticing everything. I noticed that when relatives came by, my mother would say, "He's doing so much better," in a voice pitched for the room, and then the conversation would move on, without ever including me in it. I noticed my father stopped asking me about my day, and started asking my mother about my day, while I was in earshot. I noticed Kayla, my sister, the smart one, who was 23 and working retail management and living at home to save money, had started being the only person in that house who talked to me like a person, and I noticed that she seemed to be the only one who noticed she was the only one. And I noticed the thing that actually broke something in me, which is that I had started performing. I'd started making jokes about the leg. I'd started saying, I'm good," before anybody asked. I was doing the emotional work of making my own injury comfortable for the people around me, at 26 years old, from a chair, while I could barely stand for 90 seconds without my residual limb screaming. There's a specific exhaustion in being the one who has to reassure everybody that your tragedy isn't too inconvenient. I did it for almost a year before I understood what I was doing. I stopped going out around then. Not dramatically, I just declined things, one at a time, until nobody asked anymore. A cookout, a friend's engagement party, a thing at a bar where I knew the bathroom was down a flight of stairs, which is a calculation every person in my situation runs constantly, and which nobody around them ever knows is happening. The truth is, I could have gone to most of them. What I couldn't do was be looked at. There's a particular expression people make when they see you for the first time after a flicker of something they immediately try to erase, and I'd started flinching before it even arrived. That's what I was avoiding, not the stares, the flicker. Kayla dragged me to exactly one thing that year, a birthday for a friend of hers, and I sat in a corner for 2 hours and was miserable, and on the drive home she said, "You were awful tonight," and I said I knew, and she said, "Good, next time be awful somewhere else too," which is, I think, the most useful thing anybody said to me in that entire year. The rehab was its own war, and I lost most of the early battles. I want to describe an above-knee prosthetic honestly, because movies get this catastrophically wrong. In a movie, a guy gets a leg, there's a montage, he's running on a beach. In reality, you spend the first year learning that your entire relationship with the ground has been renegotiated without your consent. You don't have a knee, you have a mechanical joint that has to be told, through the way you swing your hip, what you want it to do, and it obeys physics, not intention. Learning to trust it is a psychological problem as much as a physical one, because every instinct you have says that if you put your weight on that thing, it will fold, and you will hit a floor in front of people. I fell a lot. In the clinic, in the driveway, once in a grocery store, in the cereal aisle, in front of about 9 people, and a woman I did not know crouched down and asked if I needed help, and I said, in a voice I'm not proud of, "I'm fine," about 4 times until she left. Then I sat on that grocery store floor for another minute, because I couldn't get up on my own without a wall. The socket was the other problem. The place where the prosthetic meets what's left of your leg is a fit problem measured in millimeters, and your limb changes volume through the day, through the seasons, when you gain or lose 8 pounds. In the first 18 months, I had 4 different sockets. Between them, there were stretches where wearing the leg meant skin breakdown, and skin breakdown meant not wearing the leg at all for 2 weeks, and not wearing it for 2 weeks meant losing conditioning I'd spent a month building. My physical therapist was a woman named Priya, who I resented for approximately 5 months, and would now list among the most important people in my life. She was not warm, she was precise. When I told her, in month 7, that I was thinking about just using the chair, that plenty of people use the chair, and there's no shame in it, She agreed with me completely, and then she asked whether I wanted the chair, or whether I was choosing it because falling in front of people had become more frightening than losing my mobility. I didn't answer her that day. I answered her 4 days later, at the next session, by showing up. And underneath all of it, the money problem kept tightening. My disability rating came through in month 11, at a percentage lower than my case manager had estimated, which meant a monthly number that could not, on its own, support an independent adult in any city in America. I appealed. The appeal took another 7 months. During that time, I contributed exactly nothing to a household that was absorbing my costs. And every single person in that house knew the number, and nobody ever said it out loud, which was infinitely worse than if somebody had. There's one more thing about the rehab I should say, because it's the part that took longest and shows least. Phantom pain. I'm not going to be dramatic about it. It's not constant and it's manageable now. But for the first 2 years, there were nights where a foot that did not exist would cramp so violently I would sit up in bed at 3 in the morning and grip a leg that ended above the knee, trying to massage something that was not there. You cannot explain that to somebody who hasn't had it. I tried once, to my mother, in the first year, and I watched her face do something complicated and then change the subject, and I never brought it up in that house again. Priya was the one I told. She wasn't surprised. She said about 80% of her above-knee patients had it, and about 20% had ever told a family member. And then she asked why I thought that ratio was so lopsided. I said because it sounds insane. She said it sounds inconvenient. That's a different thing, and I think you know which one you're actually worried about. The night everything actually broke was a Tuesday in February, and it started over a bathroom. Dale had come over to help my father with something in the garage, and afterward, in the kitchen, always the kitchen, the conversation turned to a plan I hadn't been included in. My parents were thinking about selling the house. Not because of me, they said, because of the market and my father's knees and the stairs, and a smaller place would be easier. All of which was true, and none of which was the whole thing, and every adult in that room knew it. I asked where I would go, and there was a pause, a real one. 4, maybe 5 seconds, in a kitchen, with 4 adults in it, and nobody had an answer ready, which told me they'd had this conversation before, and had specifically not had this part of it. Then Dale said, "You'd figure something out. You've got the benefits." I said the number. Out loud, for the first time in 11 months, I said exactly what my monthly disability payment was, and I said what a 1-bedroom rented for in that county, and I let the 2 numbers sit in the air next to each other. Nobody said anything. And then my mother said the sentence that I have spent 4 years learning how to forgive her for. She said, "Well, you chose to enlist." I don't think she meant it the way it landed. I've since come to believe she meant something closer to, "We didn't plan for this, and I'm frightened," which is what most cruelty in families actually is underneath. Fear, wearing somebody else's clothes. But what she said was that, and what I heard was a ledger being closed on 6 years of money I'd sent into that house from 2 continents. I left the room. Kayla followed me. She sat on the end of my bed in that converted office and didn't say anything for a while. And then she said, "You know that's not true, right?" And I told her, I did know. I was lying. I lay awake most of that night doing the arithmetic I'd been avoiding for a year. Actual numbers, on my phone, in the dark, what I had, what I owed, what a life would cost, how far I was from any version of one. And somewhere around 3 in the morning, I stopped calculating how to survive in that house, and started calculating how to leave it. Those are completely different math problems, and I want to tell you honestly, the first one had been keeping me stuck for 11 months, because you cannot plan an exit while you're optimizing for a room you're trying not to be a burden in. I didn't tell anybody, not Kayla, not Priya, nobody. I've thought about why, and the honest answer is that I'd been humiliated enough in that house, that I couldn't survive announcing a plan and then failing at it in front of the same audience. So I ran it silently, for 4 months, in a bedroom, with the door mostly closed, which everybody in that house read as depression. My mother started leaving plates outside the door. I let her. It was easier than explaining, and there's a version of me that feels bad about that now. She was doing the only thing her vocabulary allowed her to do, and I took it without ever telling her the man behind that door had stopped drowning about 3 weeks earlier. That's the thing about families that don't say things directly. It runs both ways. I was fluent in it too. I started with the only asset I had, which was that I was extremely good at moving objects through a system. 8 years of logistics in the military is not nothing. I had run resupply for a company. I knew inventory, I knew scheduling under constraint, I knew how to solve a problem where the correct answer is unavailable, and you have to build the second best one out of what's actually on the ground. What I did not have was a single piece of paper that said any of that in a language a civilian hiring manager could read. So the first thing I did was the least glamorous thing in this entire story. I spent 4 months translating my own resume. I sat in that converted office with a laptop my sister loaned me, and I learned what my job was called on the outside. I found out that what I'd done was supply chain coordination, and inventory control, and vendor management, and that there were certifications civilians got for skills I'd been using at 22, in conditions no certification course could simulate. I applied for a certification program through a veterans education benefit, and it took 2 months of phone calls with 3 different offices to get approved. And I want to say for anybody in that position right now, the phone calls are the job. The phone calls are the whole first year. Nobody tells you that. I did the coursework from that bedroom 4 to 6 hours a day, with my leg off, because I'd figured out I could do more work in a day if I stopped spending my limited standing tolerance on trying to look normal in a house. I got the certificate in 7 months. Then I got rejected. A lot. I'm going to give you the real number, because the real number is the story. I applied for 61 jobs. I got 11 interviews. 9 of them went well, until the point where I stood up, or until I said the word prosthetic, or until somebody asked a question about physical requirements, in a tone that made it obvious the answer had already been decided. I'm not going to claim every rejection was discrimination. Some of them I was underqualified. Some I interviewed badly, because I was interviewing while carrying 11 months of being called a burden in my own kitchen, and that leaks into a room whether you want it to or not. But some of them were exactly what they looked like. The 62nd was a regional distribution company 40 minutes away. The man who interviewed me, a guy named Terrence, operations director, ex-Navy, looked at my resume, then at me, and asked one question about a specific supply problem I'd described. I answered it for about 6 minutes straight. He let me finish, then he said, "When can you start?" That job paid $43,000 a year. It was the single largest number anyone in my family had ever seen attached to my name. I found out about a year later, from Terrence, over a beer at a work thing, what had actually happened in that interview. He told me 2 other people on the panel had flagged the physical requirements question, and he'd shut it down before the second round. He didn't tell me because he wanted credit. He told me because he wanted me to understand it had almost gone the other way, and that I should never assume the room was fair. He also said something I've repeated to about 9 different people since. He said the mistake most veterans make in a civilian interview isn't overselling, it's the opposite. They describe 8 years of running complex operations under pressure the way you'd describe a chore, because in their old world that was just Tuesday. He said, "Nobody out here knows it was just Tuesday. You have to tell them." I drove home from that interview and did not tell my family I'd gotten the job for 2 days. I wanted to hold it by myself for a little while first. I'm not sure that reflects well on me. I'm including it anyway. I moved out 4 months after I started. A 1-bedroom apartment on the ground floor of a complex where nothing was beautiful and everything was accessible, and I paid the deposit out of my own account. And I want to tell you what that first night alone in it was like. It was terrible. I sat on a mattress on the floor of an empty apartment at 11 at night, with my leg off, and a folding chair as my only furniture, and I felt nothing like triumph. I felt a loneliness so complete it had a temperature. Because here's the thing about leaving a house where you were treated like a burden. You don't stop being the person who was treated that way. You just take him with you into a quieter room. I didn't talk to my mother for 6 weeks. Not out of strategy. I just didn't know what to say to her. And she didn't call, which I chose to interpret as an answer, and which I later found out was her thinking I needed space. Work was the thing that saved that year, and I want to be honest about why. Not because work is noble, but because work was the first place in almost 3 years where nobody in the room knew me as the one who got hurt. I was just the new coordinator who was good at the job. That's it. That was the entire gift. I was good at it. Within a year, I was running the schedule for a whole shift. Within 2, I was managing a team of 9, which is a thing I'd done at 23 in a very different context, and turned out to be the only real transferable skill I had. The physical part didn't get easier so much as it got known. I learned my limits with real precision. How many hours on the floor before the socket started costing me the next day, when to sit down, when to say give me 10 minutes out loud in front of my team, instead of hiding it in a bathroom, which took me about 18 months to be able to do, and which changed everything when I finally could. I also started swimming, which I mentioned because it turned out to matter more than I expected. Priya had suggested it 2 years earlier, and I'd dismissed it, and then a guy at work mentioned an adaptive sports program at a rec center 20 minutes out. I went once to shut him up. In the water, for the first time since I was 26, my body did what I asked it to do without negotiating. I cried in a lane at a public pool at 29 years old with goggles on so nobody could tell, and I went back every week for the next 4 years. I was not fast, I want to be clear. I was slow and inefficient, and I got beaten in every heat of the 2 small adaptive meets I eventually entered. But swimming was the first place I stopped managing a deficit and started building something, and there is an enormous difference between those 2 activities that has nothing to do with the results. The guys at that pool became something I didn't have a word for. Not a support group. Nobody there would have tolerated that phrase. Just 5 or 6 people at a rec center on a Tuesday night, most of them not veterans, most of them with bodies that had been rearranged by something, all of them completely uninterested in my story. That was the appeal. Nobody at that pool ever asked me how it happened. They asked whether I'd been doing my kick drills, which I usually hadn't. There was a woman there, Marguerite, 61, who'd had a stroke in her 40s and swam with essentially one working arm, and was faster than me for the first 2 years I knew her, which she never once let me forget. She's the one who told me to stop apologizing when I needed the lane rope. She said, "The rope's there. It's not a moral failure to use the equipment." I've applied that sentence to about 11 different areas of my life since. My father had the stroke in October, 3 years after the kitchen. It was a Sunday. Kayla called me. I want to describe the specific feeling of that call, because it's the hinge the whole story turns on. My first reaction, before the fear, was a cold, ugly thought that I am not proud of, and that I'm including, because leaving it out would make this a lie. My first thought was, now they'll need me. I hate that I thought it. I've talked to a counselor about it since, a VA counselor named Marcus, who I started seeing about 2 years after I moved out, and who is the reason I can tell this part at all. He didn't tell me the thought was fine. He asked what it had cost me to be needed by people who had made me feel disposable, and whether that thought was ambition or an old wound looking for a chance to finally be paid. It was the second one, but I got in the truck anyway. He survived. He came out of it with speech that came back slowly, and a left side that didn't come back all the way, and a driver's license that was never getting renewed. He was 59. His delivery career, and every version of a plan my parents had, ended in a hospital corridor on a Sunday afternoon, and the arithmetic in that family collapsed in about 11 days. My mother was 6 years from a pension she couldn't touch early. The house, the one they'd talked about selling in that kitchen, had a mortgage they'd refinanced twice. Dale had his own 2 kids and a wife, and a lumberyard job that had never in 10 years paid what it should have. Kayla had finally moved out and was making $12 an hour more than nothing. They sat in that hospital and did the same math I'd done at 3 in the morning in a converted office 3 years earlier. And this time, the person in the room with the most stable income, the health insurance, and the ability to absorb a hit was me. I paid the mortgage that November and December, and then I sat down with my mother at a kitchen table, and I did not make a speech. I want to be clear about that, because the version of this story where I make the speech is the version I fantasized about for 3 years, and when the moment actually came, I discovered I had no appetite for it at all. What I said was, here's what I can cover, here's what I can't, here's what we need to change about the house, and here's the number we need to hit every month. Like a supply problem, because that's what it was. And my mother listened to all of it, and then she cried, and then she said, "I'm sorry about what I said to you." She didn't specify which thing. She didn't have to. I want to tell you what I felt at that table, because it wasn't what I expected, and I think it's the truest thing in this whole story. I felt tired. That's it. 3 years of rehearsing a moment, and when it arrived, what I mostly felt was the specific tiredness of a man who has just taken on a mortgage that isn't his, sitting in a kitchen he'd been humiliated in, watching his mother cry, with no appetite whatsoever for the win he'd been promising himself at 3 in the morning for 3 years. Marcus, my counselor, had actually warned me about that. Not about the stroke, about the general shape of it. He'd told me months earlier that people who are waiting to be vindicated usually find that vindication, when it comes, doesn't do the thing they built it to do. He said the wound doesn't get healed by the other person finally understanding. It gets healed somewhere else entirely, usually earlier, usually alone, usually in a way nobody witnesses. He was right. The healing had already happened. It happened in a bedroom with a laptop and a certification course and 61 job applications. The kitchen table was just paperwork. I want to spend a minute on what it actually costs to become your family's provider, because that's a nice sentence in a video title and a much heavier thing to live inside of. For the next 2 years, roughly a third of my income went into that house. I moved into a smaller apartment to make the numbers work. No vacations. A truck with 190,000 miles on it and a repair I put off 4 months longer than I should have. I got the promotions I'd been working toward, supervisor, then assistant operations manager, and the raises went almost entirely into a house I did not live in. There's a detail from that stretch I think about more than the money. About 4 months in, I was at the house on a weekday morning before a late shift, and I had to help my father get from the bed to a chair. Transfer, they call it. I'd been on the receiving end of exactly that maneuver, hundreds of times, at 26, from people who were kind about it, and from people who were efficient about it, and I had hated every single one. So I knew, from the inside, exactly what it feels like to be the body being moved. I talked him through it. I told him what I was doing before I did it. I didn't rush him. I did not say, "There we go," in the voice people use, because I know what that voice does to a grown man. He looked at me afterward, out of breath in that chair, and didn't say anything. But he'd noticed. That's the only thing I've ever been able to point to as something the leg gave me instead of took. And here's the part I did not expect. It was not satisfying. There was no moment of vindication. Nobody stood up and acknowledged the reversal. My family just adjusted the way families do, and within about 8 months my role as the one who covered things stopped being remarked on at all, which is exactly what had happened when I was 20 and sending money home from a deployment, and which I found darkly funny in a way I couldn't explain to anyone. Dale was the hard one. He didn't say thank you for almost a year, and I understood why long before I forgave him for it. For 34 years, being the reliable son was the only thing Dale had that was entirely his, and I had taken it, from a chair, with one leg. We had it out in a parking lot outside a rehab facility. He said something short and sharp about me, showing up with a checkbook, and I said, the only line in this entire story I've ever been proud of saying, I'm not doing this to win. I'm doing it because I know what it feels like to be the one who can't. He didn't respond. He got in his truck. But 2 weeks later, he called me to ask my opinion about something with Dad's medication schedule, which was the first time in my adult life my older brother had asked me what I thought about anything, and I understood exactly what the call was. My father was the easiest. The stroke took some things and gave back a strange, unfiltered directness. About a year in, on the porch, he said out of nowhere, in the slow speech he had then, "You sent money home, from over there." I never said anything about it, and I said, "I know," and he said, "That was wrong of me." 22 years of a man not saying things, and a burst blood vessel is what it took. I'm not going to pretend that's a fair trade. I'll just tell you I took it. Kayla was the one who kept it all from cracking that first year. The appointments, the medication schedule, a job she traded down for a schedule that let her be at the house 4 afternoons a week. At one point I offered to send her money for it, monthly, the way I'd sent money home at 20, and she got angry, which she almost never does, and said, "Don't turn me into a line item. You know what that does to a person." She'd been in that house for all 11 months. She'd watched it happen to me from 4 feet away, and I had somehow come within 1 sentence of doing the exact thing to my sister that had been done to me. I dropped it. We split the driving instead. If you've made it this far with me, I want to invite you to subscribe to our channel and join us every day. I think a lot of us have been the person in the next room, hearing how we're talked about when we're not supposed to be listening. It helps, sometimes, to hear how somebody else got out the other side of that. Now let me tell you about last summer. My mother turned 62. There was a thing at the house, nothing formal, 20 people in a backyard, the kind of thing my family does with folding chairs and too much potato salad. Dale's kids, who are teenagers now, and who have never in their conscious memory known me as anything except the uncle with the leg who takes them to the pool. I'd been at that house maybe 400 times since the stroke. It's not a place I dread anymore. It's just a house where I handle certain things. At some point in the afternoon, I was standing at the edge of the yard talking to my brother-in-law, and my nephew, Dale's oldest, 15, came over and asked me, in front of about 6 adults, what it had been like to lose a leg. Nobody had asked me that in 9 years. Not once. Not one member of my family, in 9 years, had asked me directly what it was actually like. The yard got a little quiet in that specific way, and I watched my mother's face go tight, and I watched Dale start to move to interrupt him, and I put my hand up, and I told the kid the truth. Not the graphic version, the real one. I told him the hardest part wasn't the leg. I told him the hardest part was the 2 years afterward when I couldn't do anything for anybody, and that I'd grown up in a house where being useful was how you knew you counted, and that when I couldn't be useful anymore, I stopped being sure I counted at all. I said it in front of every single person who had made me feel that way. Not as an accusation, just as an answer to a 15-year-old's honest question. Nobody said anything for a second. Then my nephew said, "That's messed up." In the flat way, teenagers deliver devastating things, and then he asked if I could still swim, and I said better than him, and he said prove it, and that was the end of the moment. I looked over at my mother once after. She was looking at the grass. Later, in the kitchen, doing dishes, she said, without turning around, "I didn't know that's how it was." And I said, "I know you didn't," which was the most honest exchange the two of us have ever had, and it happened over a sink, with her back to me, which is I think how most of the real conversations in that family have always gone. Dale drove me to my truck that night. I hadn't needed a ride in years. He just walked out with me, and at the end of the driveway he stopped and said, without any setup, I said something in the kitchen, years ago, I don't know if you heard it. I told him I'd heard it. He nodded and he stood there for a second, and then he said the only thing he could have said that would have landed, which was not an apology. He said, I was scared you were going to be there forever, and I was going to be the one doing it. And I said, I know. I was scared of the same thing. That's the whole reconciliation. Two men at the end of a driveway, admitting they'd been frightened of the identical future from opposite sides of it. No hug. He got in his truck. But something that had been sitting in my chest for 9 years went out of it right there, on a driveway, in the dark, in about 40 seconds. I'm 35 now. I run operations for 2 facilities. I still swim on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Still slow. Still last in most heats. Still going. My father passed 2 winters ago. He got about 3.5 years after the stroke, and they were reduced years, but they weren't empty ones. And I was there, and I have never once regretted $1 of what those years cost me. My mother lives in a smaller place now, 1 floor, which I helped find and helped move her into, and which I cover part of. Dale and I split the rest. That's a sentence I want to sit on for a second. Dale and I split it. It took 9 years to get to a sentence like that. People sometimes ask if I forgave them, and I've stopped giving the short answer, because the short answer is yes, and the short answer is misleading. What actually happened is slower and less noble than forgiveness. I stopped needing my family to have been different than they were. There's a difference. Forgiveness sounds like a door swinging open. What I did was more like putting down something I'd been carrying in one hand for years, and then noticing, later, that both my hands were free. I don't think my brother is a bad man. I think he was tired and frightened and 31. I don't think my mother is a cruel woman. I think she was watching her whole plan come apart and said the worst available sentence to the person least able to survive hearing it. That doesn't make it okay. It just makes it human, which is a lower bar, and most of the time, the only one anybody actually clears. I don't know who's been talking about you in the next room. Maybe it's family, maybe it's a workplace, or a marriage, or a version of yourself you've been hearing about secondhand for years. I'm not going to tell you they'll come around, because some don't, and mine only did after a hospital corridor forced the issue. I'll just tell you that the ledger they're keeping on you isn't the real one. And the only thing that ever moved the actual number was the 4 months I spent alone in a bedroom teaching myself what my own job was called. If this one landed for you, hit follow, and send it to 5 people who might need it tonight. You never know who's sitting in a room right now, hearing themselves described as a problem. Tell me honestly, in the comments, what part of this stayed with you? And tell me what story you want to hear next. I'm always looking, and the next one might be closer to your own life than you think. I'll see you tomorrow.